In February 1997, at a neighborhood in Southfield, Michigan, a quiet suburban street buried under winter silence where nothing ever seemed out of place. But inside one of those homes, something had already gone horribly wrong. Deborah Renee Kennedy didn't show up for work that morning at General Motors. No warning, no call, no trace of urgency, just absence. At first, it looked like a routine welfare check, the kind police handle every day, until they stepped inside her home. No forced entry, no clear sign of a break-in, but there was evidence of a struggle, and something investigators couldn't explain at the time. Fingerprints left behind on a credit card, DNA hidden beneath her fingernails, clues that should have solved everything, but it didn't. Because in 1997, the science simply wasn't ready. So the case went cold for 29 years, until one quiet review reopened everything and led investigators back to someone who allegedly lived just across the street, right in plain sight. While the case slept, the answer may have been watching from a window. And when modern forensic science finally spoke, it didn't suggest a stranger. It pointed to someone familiar, someone close, too close. So the question isn't just what happened to Deborah Kennedy, it's how someone so close stayed invisible for nearly 3 decades. Before we dive deeper into the story of Deborah Renee Kennedy, comment where you are watching from and kindly consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us continue producing in-depth crime documentaries like this one. Stories that not only seek answers for victims and their families, but also raise awareness about the circumstances surrounding these crimes. Your support helps this channel grow and continue its mission of using knowledge, awareness, and education as tools in the fight against crime. Now, let's get to the details of Deborah Renee Kennedy. In February 1997, winter had settled heavily over Southfield, Michigan. Snow lined the quiet suburban streets, covering lawns and driveways in a blanket of white. The neighborhood was the kind of place where routines rarely changed. Neighbors waved from a distance. Porch lights flickered on at dusk. Most people believed they knew who lived around them and who belonged there. It was the sort of community where danger felt far away. And that is exactly why what happened next would leave investigators haunted for nearly 3 decades. Because in this story, the mystery wasn't hidden in some distant city. It wasn't buried in a criminal underworld. It wasn't even committed by a stranger passing through town. If investigators are right, the answer had been sitting directly across the street the entire time, and nobody knew. Or perhaps more unsettlingly, nobody suspected. Imagine waking up one morning and looking out your front window. You see a familiar house, a familiar driveway, a familiar face walking to a mailbox. Someone you've seen dozens of times, maybe hundreds. Someone who blends so completely into everyday life that you stop noticing them altogether. Now imagine discovering nearly 30 years later that this ordinary face may have been connected to one of the community's most enduring mysteries. A mystery that stole answers from a family. A mystery that outlived entire generations of technology. A mystery that remained silent for 29 years. Today, we examine the case of Deborah Renee Kennedy, a woman whose life was abruptly interrupted in February of 1997, a case that baffled investigators for decades, and a case that would ultimately be revived by something that did not exist when the investigation first began: modern forensic science. But before we get there, before the DNA, before the fingerprint match, before the arrest, there is a far more disturbing question. How could someone leave behind evidence capable of solving a case and still remain unidentified for nearly 3 decades? At first glance, it sounds impossible. After all, we live in an era where surveillance cameras seem to be everywhere. Phones track movements. Databases connect information instantly. Investigators can analyze evidence in ways that would have sounded like science fiction in the 1990s. But Deborah Kennedy's case began in a different world. A world where detectives often relied on witness statements, physical evidence, and patience. Lots of patience. Because even when evidence existed, technology often lacked the ability to reveal its secrets. Sometimes the clues were there. They simply couldn't speak. Not yet. And in Deborah's case, investigators would eventually learn that the answers had been waiting quietly for decades, preserved, dormant, waiting for the future. What makes this story particularly unsettling is not merely the length of time it remained unsolved. It is where investigators eventually claim the trail led. When people think about cold cases, they often imagine an unknown figure disappearing into the shadows. Someone who flees the city, someone who vanishes across state lines, someone who leaves behind no connection to the victim. But what if the opposite were true? What if the person responsible didn't need to disappear immediately? What if they didn't need to travel far at all? What if every day neighbors unknowingly passed by the answer? What if the mystery wasn't hidden? What if it was simply overlooked? That possibility would become one of the most chilling aspects of this entire investigation. Because according to authorities, the man eventually arrested had lived directly across the street from Deborah at the time of her death. Not across town, not across the state, across the street, close enough to see her home, close enough to know the neighborhood, close enough to blend in completely. But long before investigators arrived at that conclusion, there was only confusion, questions, and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The first indication came not from a dramatic emergency call, not from a witness reporting suspicious activity, not from a passerby discovering a crime scene. Instead, it came from something surprisingly ordinary: a missed day of work. For many people, missing a day might not seem unusual. Life happens, schedules change, people call in sick. But sometimes routines tell a deeper story. And when someone is known for reliability, even a small disruption can become an alarm bell. That alarm bell began ringing when Deborah Kennedy failed to appear where she was expected. At first, it may have seemed insignificant, a delay, a misunderstanding, perhaps a last-minute issue. But as concern grew, so did the realization that this was not normal. Something had interrupted a routine that rarely changed. And when investigators eventually entered Deborah's home, they would discover evidence suggesting that whatever happened there had unfolded suddenly, unexpectedly, and violently enough to leave behind clues that would endure for generations. Think about that for a moment. Evidence can be an extraordinary thing. Unlike memories, it does not forget. Unlike witnesses, it does not move away. Unlike rumors, it does not change with time. It waits, patiently, sometimes for years, for decades, and sometimes longer than the people investigating it. The remarkable reality of this case is that critical evidence survived nearly 30 years. It sat quietly inside evidence storage, year after year, administration after administration, detective after detective, while the world changed around it. The internet expanded. Cell phones became smartphones. Entire careers began and ended. Yet the evidence remained, silent, waiting, almost as if the case itself refused to disappear. But there is another reason this story continues to fascinate investigators, because it raises a question that many cold cases never answer. Was this mystery truly unsolvable, or was it simply ahead of its time? Imagine being a detective in 1997. You collect evidence, you process the scene, you follow leads, you do everything by the book. Yet the answer remains just out of reach, not because the clue is missing, not because the evidence was mishandled, but because the technology needed to understand it has not been invented yet. How frustrating would that be? How many times would investigators revisit the file and wonder whether the solution was already sitting inside a storage box? How many times would family members hope for answers that never seemed to arrive? And how many years would pass before someone decided to look again? Because eventually, someone did. And when they reopened the case, they would discover something astonishing. The evidence had not lost its value. The evidence had gained value. What investigators once viewed through the limitations of 1997 could now be examined through the lens of modern forensic science. Suddenly, clues that had remained silent for decades began speaking. And what they revealed would send shockwaves through a case that many believed might never be solved. But before we reach that turning point, before the scientific breakthrough, before the arrest that would make national headlines, we need to understand the woman at the center of this story. Because every cold case file begins with a name. Every investigation begins with a life. And before Deborah Renee Kennedy became the subject of a decades-long mystery, she was a daughter, a relative, a coworker, a friend, a woman with routines, ambitions, and plans for the future. Plans that would never be fulfilled. And in the next chapter, we'll step back from the investigation and meet Deborah herself. Who was she? What was her life like in Southfield? What did family and friends remember most about her? And why did her sudden absence immediately trigger concern? Those answers reveal far more than a biography. They reveal what was truly lost. Long before detectives opened evidence boxes, long before forensic scientists compared DNA profiles, long before reporters described her case as one of Michigan's longest-running mysteries, Deborah Renee Kennedy was simply living her life, and that is an important distinction. Because true crime often begins at the end of a story, a headline, an investigation, an arrest, a courtroom. But for the people at the center of these cases, life was never defined by those moments. Life was defined by ordinary days. The routines nobody thinks about until they're suddenly interrupted. The conversations nobody realizes will become memories. The plans that seem guaranteed to happen tomorrow. Deborah had those things too. And understanding who she was is essential to understanding why her absence was noticed so quickly, why her family never stopped caring, and why investigators refused to let her case disappear into history. In 1997, Deborah Renee Kennedy was 40 years old. She lived in Southfield, Michigan, a suburban community north of Detroit known for its neighborhoods, businesses, and working professionals. She was employed at the General Motors Technical Center in nearby Warren. For many people in southeastern Michigan, working for General Motors represented stability. It represented responsibility. It represented a career built through dedication and consistency. The automotive industry was woven into the identity of the region. People showed up. They worked hard. They built futures. And by all accounts, Deborah embodied that same reliability. The kind of person others expected to see, expected to hear from, expected to show up every single day. Reliability is one of those traits that rarely attracts attention. Nobody writes headlines about it. Nobody celebrates it publicly. Yet it becomes incredibly important when someone suddenly breaks from their routine. Think about the people in your own life. There are individuals whose habits are so predictable that any deviation feels immediately unusual. The coworker who always arrives first. The friend who never misses a call. The family member who checks in every week without fail. When those routines stop, concern follows. And concern often begins before anyone understands why. That pattern would become critically important in Deborah's story. Because the people around her knew something wasn't right long before investigators uncovered the reason. Family members later described Deborah as warm and deeply loved, not because of a single achievement, not because of public recognition, but because of the way she treated people. The way many beloved family members are remembered, through kindness, through consistency, through presence. The simple but powerful things that become impossible to replace once they're gone. Years after her death, relatives still spoke about her with affection, still remembered her, still carried the weight of unanswered questions. That alone tells us something important. Time may soften certain wounds, but it rarely erases them, especially when there are no answers, especially when a family spends decades wondering what happened. One of the most difficult realities of unsolved cases is the uncertainty. A conviction can bring accountability. A verdict can provide closure. Even difficult truths can eventually become accepted, but unanswered questions create something different. They create an emotional vacuum. A space where families are left replaying possibilities, wondering whether justice will ever arrive, whether anyone still cares, wondering whether the person responsible will ever be identified. For Deborah's loved ones, those questions would stretch across nearly 3 decades. Think about what that means. Children grow into adults. Parents become grandparents. Entire chapters of life unfold. And still, the mystery remains. Still, the waiting continues. Yet before any of that happened, Deborah was simply moving through what appeared to be a normal winter week. There were no public reports suggesting she expected danger, no indication that family members believed a crisis was approaching, no warning that this ordinary routine was about to become the beginning of a decades-long investigation. And perhaps that's one of the most unsettling aspects of many true crime cases. Life often looks completely normal right before it changes forever. The day before a major event rarely announces itself. There is no dramatic soundtrack, no flashing warning sign. No message telling someone that this moment will matter years later. People make plans, they go to work, they return home, they prepare for tomorrow, believing tomorrow will arrive exactly as expected. For Deborah, home represented familiarity, a place where routines unfolded, a place where she could close the door and leave the outside world behind. The neighborhood itself appeared ordinary, the kind of place where residents recognized familiar vehicles, recognized familiar faces, recognized familiar houses, a neighborhood where strangers often stand out, which makes one future detail particularly haunting. Because when investigators eventually identified a suspect decades later, authorities would not point to a mysterious outsider. They would point towards someone allegedly connected to the immediate surroundings, someone nearby, someone visible, someone familiar to the landscape of the neighborhood. That revelation would force many observers to reconsider a basic assumption, the assumption that danger always comes from far away. As the days leading up to February 19, 1997 unfolded, nothing publicly known suggested Deborah was preparing for an extraordinary event. Instead, she appeared to be doing what millions of Americans do every day, going about life, working, managing responsibilities, looking ahead to the future. That normalcy is precisely what makes the next development so significant, because when a person with established routines suddenly disappears from those routines, the absence becomes a clue, not a solution, a clue. And in Deborah's case, that clue appeared in the form of something deceptively simple. She didn't show up. At first, that might sound minor. People miss appointments, people run late, people take unexpected leave, but context matters, patterns matter. And those who knew Deborah understood that this wasn't typical behavior. Something was off. The challenge was figuring out what. Imagine being one of her coworkers. Perhaps you glance at the clock. Maybe you expect her to arrive at any moment. Then another hour passes. Then another. At first, there may be innocent explanations. Traffic, illness, an emergency. But eventually concern replaces assumption. The absence becomes impossible to ignore. And what began as a question slowly becomes a fear. Where is Deborah? Why hasn't anyone heard from her? What could possibly explain this? Those questions would ultimately lead authorities to her home, a decision that would transform concern into something far more serious. Looking back now, it's tempting to search for warning signs. People often do that after tragedies. They examine every detail, every interaction, every circumstance, trying to find the moment where everything changed. But the reality is often less obvious. Many investigations begin precisely because there were no obvious signs, no dramatic confrontation, no public conflict, no clear indication of what was about to happen. Only an ordinary day, followed by an extraordinary silence. And that silence was about to trigger a chain of events that would leave investigators staring at one of Michigan's most enduring mysteries. What nobody knew at the time was that Deborah's home already contained the clues that could eventually identify a suspect. The evidence was there. The answers were there. Even the future breakthrough was there. But no one had the tools to see it yet. The technology of 1997 would prove insufficient. The evidence would outlive the investigation's momentum, and the case would begin a long journey into uncertainty. But before it became a cold case, before decades passed, before science changed everything, investigators first had to confront a far more immediate reality. Something had happened inside Deborah Kennedy's home, something serious enough to stop her routine forever. And when authorities entered that house, they found themselves standing at the beginning of a mystery that would refuse to die. The day began like countless others across southeastern Michigan. Commuters prepared for work, schools opened their doors, businesses settled into their routines. Cars rolled through neighborhoods, still carrying traces of winter's chill. For most people, it was just another Wednesday, a day that would soon blend into memory. But for Deborah Renee Kennedy, February 19 would become the dividing line between the life she had built and a mystery that would outlive the century itself, and nobody around her knew it yet. One of the most unsettling things about true crime investigations is how rarely they begin with certainty. Instead, they begin with small inconsistencies, a missed appointment, an unanswered phone call, a routine interrupted. At first, those details appear harmless. The human mind naturally searches for ordinary explanations. People get delayed, people become busy, people change plans. But occasionally, what appears ordinary is anything but. And when Deborah failed to appear where she was expected, concern began to spread among those who knew her. Not panic, not immediately, just concern. The kind of concern that starts as a quiet question, then gradually grows louder. Think about how routines shape our lives. Most people follow patterns without even realizing it. Wake up, prepare for the day, go to work, return home, repeat. These routines become so predictable that when they suddenly stop, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. That's what happened in Deborah's case. Her coworkers knew her, they understood her habits, they understood her level of responsibility, and when she failed to appear, something felt wrong. Not because of one missed moment, but because the absence didn't fit the person they knew. The pattern had broken, and the break was significant enough that people began looking for answers. As concern increased, efforts were made to determine what had happened. Had she become ill? Had an emergency arisen? Had there been some misunderstanding? These were reasonable possibilities. In fact, they were probably the possibilities people hoped were true, because the alternative was far more troubling. Eventually, authorities were asked to conduct a welfare check at Deborah's residence in Southfield. It was a simple request, a precaution, the sort of action taken when someone hasn't been heard from and concern has reached a certain threshold. Nobody could have known that this routine check would open the door to a case that would remain unsolved for nearly 3 decades. When officers arrived at Deborah's home, they were entering a place that should have represented safety, a familiar environment, a private space. A place where routines continued after work ended. But something inside immediately told investigators that this was not a normal missing person situation. This was something else entirely, something far more serious. Inside the residence, authorities discovered evidence that indicated a confrontation had taken place. The details released publicly over the years have remained limited, and for good reason. Investigators often withhold specific information to preserve the integrity of a case. But what became clear was that Deborah had encountered someone inside her home, and that encounter had ended in tragedy. For detectives, the first hours of any investigation are often crucial. Questions begin forming immediately. Who was the last person to see the victim? Who had access to the home? Was anything taken? Were there signs of forced entry? Did neighbors hear anything unusual? Every answer has the potential to push an investigation closer to the truth, and every unanswered question creates another challenge. One detail quickly stood out. Investigators reportedly found no signs of forced entry. That observation would become one of the most important pieces of the entire case, because it suggested something significant. Someone may have entered the home without having to force their way inside. Now consider what that means. When detectives encounter a forced entry, they often have a clear starting point. A door kicked open, a broken window, visible evidence that someone entered unlawfully. But when no forced entry exists, possibilities multiply. Perhaps the victim knew the person. Perhaps the door was opened voluntarily. Perhaps there was another explanation entirely. Whatever the answer, investigators understood one thing immediately. The circumstances were more complicated than they first appeared. And complexity can be both a blessing and a curse in criminal investigations. It creates avenues to explore, but it also creates countless opportunities for uncertainty. As detectives processed the scene, they began collecting evidence. At the time, this was standard procedure: photographs, physical items, fingerprints, biological material, anything that might help reconstruct what happened. Investigators knew they had only one chance to preserve the scene correctly, because once a moment passes, it can never be recreated. Every detail mattered, even details that appeared insignificant at the time, especially those details. What nobody realized was that some of the evidence being collected that day would eventually become the most important evidence in the entire case. Not immediately, not even within the next few years, but decades later. Among the items recovered were fingerprints found on a credit card located in the residence. Investigators also recovered biological evidence from beneath Deborah's fingernails. To modern audiences, those discoveries may sound incredibly promising. Today, DNA evidence is often associated with dramatic breakthroughs and rapid identifications. But in 1997, the reality was different. The science existed, yet its capabilities were far more limited. Databases were smaller. Analytical methods were less advanced. Many of the tools investigators rely on today either did not exist or were still in their infancy. As a result, evidence that might seem decisive in hindsight could not always produce immediate answers. And that is where the frustration began. Imagine being an investigator standing inside that home. You know evidence exists. You know clues have been preserved. You know the person responsible likely left something behind. Yet every avenue seems to end before reaching a definitive conclusion. The evidence whispers. But it does not speak clearly enough. Not yet. Cases like this are among the most difficult to investigate because they create the feeling that the answer is close, just beyond reach, visible, but inaccessible. And that feeling would follow this case for years. As the days turned into weeks, detectives pursued leads. They examined evidence. They interviewed individuals. They followed the investigative pathways available to them. But no breakthrough emerged. The case remained active, then gradually became colder, then colder still. Each passing month made solving the mystery more difficult. Memories faded. Potential witnesses relocated. Details became harder to verify. The investigation began facing the enemy. Every cold case eventually encounters time. Time is relentless. It affects every criminal investigation. Witness recollections become less precise. Physical evidence can degrade if not preserved properly. Investigative momentum slows. Public attention shifts elsewhere. New cases arrive. Resources are divided. And before long, a once active investigation risks becoming another file stored away in a cabinet, waiting. That is precisely what happened to Deborah Kennedy's case. Not because investigators stopped caring, not because the evidence disappeared, but because the available tools could not take the investigation any further. The clues remained. The answers did not. Years passed, then decades. The world transformed around the case. Technology advanced. Entire generations of forensic techniques emerged. And still Deborah's file remained unsolved. For her family, every passing year carried the same painful question. Would they ever know who was responsible? Would anyone ever be held accountable? Or would the case remain trapped in the past forever? Those questions lingered for 29 years. But hidden within evidence storage, something extraordinary was happening. The very evidence that failed to solve the case in 1997 was becoming more valuable with every passing year. Not because the evidence changed, because science did. And when investigators eventually decided to reopen the case, they would discover that the future had finally caught up with the past. The clues that once remained silent were about to speak, and what they revealed would change everything. In the next chapter, we'll examine the investigation itself. The years of frustration, the cold case review, the forensic breakthroughs, the fingerprint match, the DNA connection, and the astonishing moment investigators realized that after nearly 3 decades, the mystery may finally have an answer. For 29 years, Deborah Renee Kennedy's case sat in silence, not because it was forgotten, not because it was dismissed, but because every investigative tool available in 1997 eventually hit a wall it could not climb over. Detectives had evidence, they had preserved materials, they even had potential leads that at the time could not be fully developed. And then, as the years passed, something unusual began to happen. The case didn't weaken, it stabilized, almost as if it was waiting for something that did not yet exist. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time, but that description is only half true. Because while the crime does not change, everything around it does. Technology evolves, forensic science advances, databases expand, and investigators return to old evidence with entirely new capabilities. That is exactly what began to happen in Michigan cold case units. By the 2020s, law enforcement agencies across the United States had begun revisiting older files, cases where biological or fingerprint evidence existed but had never produced a match. Deborah Kennedy's case was one of them. In 2024, a renewed cold case review initiative gave investigators a second chance, a quiet but powerful shift in strategy. Instead of focusing only on new crimes, detectives began asking a different question. What if the answers were already in storage, just waiting for better science? Deborah's case file was pulled. Evidence boxes were reopened. Materials that had been sealed for decades were carefully re-examined under modern forensic standards. And this time, the technology was different, far more sensitive, far more precise, far more capable of extracting information that previously could not be detected. The first major breakthrough came from fingerprints. Among the preserved evidence was a credit card recovered from the crime scene. Years earlier, fingerprints had been collected from that item. But at the time, they had not produced a usable identification. Now, those same prints were reprocessed through updated automated fingerprint identification systems. Systems that did not exist in 1997. systems capable of comparing prints across far larger databases in seconds. And this time, something happened. A potential match emerged. Not immediately public, not immediately confirmed, but strong enough to change the direction of the entire investigation. But investigators didn't stop there, because modern cold case work rarely relies on a single piece of evidence. Instead, it builds convergence, multiple independent confirmations pointing toward the same result. So detectives turned to the second critical piece of evidence, DNA. A biological material had been recovered from beneath Deborah Kennedy's fingernails during the original 1997 investigation. At the time, DNA analysis was limited, partial profiles, incomplete interpretations. No match in available systems. But in the decades since, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Profiles became more detailed, databases expanded nationwide, and forensic sensitivity improved to levels previously unimaginable. So the evidence was tested again. And this time, it spoke more clearly. The DNA profile generated from the evidence was compared against modern databases, and investigators received something they had not seen in decades, a hit. Not just any hit, a match that aligned with the fingerprint lead, two independent forensic pathways, both pointing in the same direction. For investigators, this was the moment the case shifted from cold file to active pursuit. Because when fingerprint and DNA evidence converge, the probability of coincidence drops significantly. It is no longer speculation, it becomes direction. That direction led investigators to a name, Robert Joseph Covington. According to law enforcement reports, Covington had once lived directly across the street from Deborah Kennedy in 1997, a detail that immediately reshaped the entire case narrative, because this was no longer an unknown intruder. This was someone who had been geographically close, socially integrated into the same environment, part of the same residential landscape, and now allegedly connected to forensic evidence recovered from the scene. For investigators, proximity changes everything. When a suspect is unknown, the search expands outward. But when a suspect is local, the investigation turns inward. It forces a re-examination of everything previously assumed. Did neighbors see anything? Did anyone notice unusual behavior? Was there any overlooked interaction between victim and suspect? Suddenly, the case was no longer about finding a stranger. It was about reinterpreting familiarity. And then came another striking detail. According to reporting, the suspect moved away from the area shortly after the time of the crime. Not immediately confirmed as significant at the time, but in hindsight, a detail that investigators would scrutinize heavily. Because in many cold cases, changes in residence patterns after a crime can become an important investigative factor. Not proof, not conclusion, but context. And context, in investigations like this, matters deeply. By early 2026, law enforcement had enough information to act. The investigation transitioned from cold case review to active criminal prosecution, and after nearly 3 decades of silence, movement returned to the case. Authorities located Covington in Illinois. Surveillance and legal procedures were initiated, and on March 29, 2026, he was arrested. Arrests in cold cases carry a unique emotional weight. For investigators, it represents closure of a professional cycle that may have lasted years or even decades. For families, it marks the moment waiting ends and reality begins again. And for the justice system, it represents the transition from investigation to courtroom examination. But importantly, an arrest is not a conclusion. It is a threshold, a point where allegations must now be tested under legal scrutiny. Covington was extradited back to Michigan in early April 2026. He was formally charged with open murder and felony murder. Under Michigan law, open murder allows prosecutors flexibility in proving whether the charge should ultimately be first or second-degree murder, depending on trial evidence. Felony murder adds another legal dimension, tied to the circumstances surrounding the alleged offense. At this stage, the case entered its next phase. Not investigation, but prosecution. And yet, even with arrests made and charges filed, one central reality remains. This is not yet a concluded case. There is no final verdict, no jury decision, no sentencing. Only allegations supported by forensic evidence now being tested in the legal system. Still, for investigators, this moment represents something rare. A cold case that did not end in silence. A file that did not remain unsolved forever. A mystery that eventually yielded to time. Not because it was forgotten, but because science advanced far enough to reopen it. In the next chapter, we move into the courtroom dimension, the legal framework, the prosecution strategy, the defense arguments, and how Michigan law defines and interprets charges like open murder and felony murder in a case built largely on forensic evidence decades after the fact. By the time the case of Deborah Renee Kennedy entered the courtroom phase, the investigation had already lived two separate lives. The first began in 1997, when investigators collected evidence inside a quiet Southfield home under uncertain circumstances. The second began nearly 3 decades later, when modern forensic science reopened what time had nearly closed forever. But courtrooms do not deal in timelines. They deal in standards, burden of proof, admissibility, reasonable doubt, and whether the evidence, no how old, can withstand legal scrutiny. In criminal law, an arrest is not the endpoint of a story. It is the beginning of its most demanding phase. Because everything that was previously gathered in private, by detectives, forensic analysts, and cold case investigators, must now be tested in public, before a judge, before a jury, under rules designed not to find truth quickly, but to ensure fairness. And in this case, that process becomes especially significant because of one central factor: time. Nearly 29 years had passed between the crime and the arrest. That gap introduces legal complexity. Witness memory reliability becomes a factor. Evidence chain of custody documentation must be carefully reviewed, and defense counsel gains the opportunity to challenge whether scientific conclusions drawn decades later can reliably speak for events in 1997. This is where cold cases become legally intricate, because while science can advance, the law requires consistency in how evidence is handled and interpreted. Prosecutors in cases like this typically build what is known as a convergence-based argument. Rather than relying on a single piece of evidence, they present multiple independent strands that point toward the same conclusion. In Deborah Kennedy's case, those strands include fingerprint evidence recovered from a credit card at the scene, DNA evidence recovered from beneath the victim's fingernails, modern forensic database matches linking both to a single individual. Each piece, on its own, may invite scrutiny. Together, they are intended to form a unified narrative of identification. But defense strategy in cold cases often focuses on time-based challenges. Questions such as, was the evidence contaminated over decades? Were storage conditions adequate? Could transfer of DNA have occurred indirectly? Were fingerprint interpretations affected by older classification methods? These are not rhetorical questions in court. They are technical arguments that can shape whether evidence is considered reliable. And in a jury trial, reliability is everything. Because jurors are asked to decide not just what might have happened, but what has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Another key legal concept in this case is the charge itself. Open murder allows the prosecution to present evidence without initially limiting the charge to first-degree or second-degree murder. This flexibility is important in complex cases because it allows the jury or court to determine intent and degree based on the evidence presented during trial. The felony murder rule holds that if a death occurs during the commission of certain felonies, the legal responsibility can escalate to murder charges depending on jurisdictional application and prosecutorial theory. In practice, prosecutors may include this charge when reconstructing the circumstances of an alleged crime suggests an underlying felony may have occurred alongside the fatal event. However, despite the legal framing, the prosecution's central challenge remains consistent. They must connect forensic evidence from 1997 to a specific individual in a way that is both scientifically valid and legally admissible, and that connection must remain stable under cross-examination. Cold case prosecutions often hinge on expert testimony. Forensic analysts become central witnesses. Their role is not just to present findings, but to explain methodology. How DNA profiles were extracted, how matches were confirmed, how statistical probability supports identification, how fingerprint comparisons were validated using modern systems. This is where science meets persuasion. Because juries must understand not only what was found, but why it can be trusted. In contrast, the defense typically emphasizes uncertainty, not necessarily by disproving evidence outright, but by introducing alternative interpretations. For example, could fingerprint residue have been deposited innocently at an earlier time? Could DNA have been transferred indirectly through environmental contact? Were investigative assumptions influenced by confirmation bias after reopening the case? These arguments do not need to definitively break the prosecution's case. They only need to introduce reasonable doubt, and that standard is intentionally high. Another factor unique to cold cases is emotional distance. Jurors are not experiencing the passage of time the way investigators or families did. To them, the case begins in the courtroom, not in 1997, which means attorneys must bridge a psychological gap, transforming decades-old evidence into immediate relevance, making the past feel present. Without sensationalism, without speculation, but only structured reasoning. For families of victims, this phase can be especially difficult, because the courtroom does not provide emotional closure quickly. It provides procedural progress, hearings, motions, arguments, delays, each step necessary, but slow. And for families who waited decades already, time inside the legal system can feel like an extension of waiting itself. As of the latest publicly available information in 2026, the case remains in the judicial process. That means no final verdict has been reached, no sentencing has been issued. The charges are still being tested in court. This is an important distinction for factual accuracy, because in true crime storytelling, resolution must never be assumed prematurely. Still, what cannot be ignored is the significance of this stage. Regardless of outcome, the case has already crossed a threshold many cold cases never reach. It has entered formal prosecution. That alone represents a major shift from uncertainty to accountability. And yet, even here, one truth remains consistent. The courtroom does not solve the past. It interprets it. It evaluates evidence that time has already shaped. And it asks a question that defines every criminal trial in the United States. Has the evidence proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? In the final chapter, we step away from the courtroom and return to the human center of this case, the family. Their reaction to the arrest, the emotional weight of nearly 3 decades of waiting, and the broader lesson this case leaves behind about safety, awareness, and how modern forensic science is reshaping justice long after crimes occur. There is a moment in every long-running investigation when the case stops being just a file. It stops being evidence, stops being reports, stops being timelines and exhibits, and becomes something far more human. A memory that never stopped hurting. For the family of Deborah Renee Kennedy, that transformation did not happen in 1997. It did not happen in the years that followed, and it did not happen when the case went cold. It happened much later, when silence finally broke, when investigators returned with answers, or at least the beginning of them. Nearly 29 years is not just a measure of time, it is an entire generation of waiting. Children become adults, parents age into grandparents. Entire family structures shift while one question remains unchanged. What happened to her? That is the reality that surrounded Deborah Kennedy's case, a question that refused to fade, even when the world moved on, even when the investigation slowed, even when the file was stored away in cold case archives. The absence never disappeared, it simply became quieter. When authorities finally made the arrest in 2026, the emotional reaction from family members reflected something complex. Not just relief, not just grief, but the collision of both at the same time. Because arrests in cold cases do not erase the past, they reopen it. Suddenly, families are pulled back into memories they had learned to carry silently. And for many, that moment brings clarity. But it also brings emotional weight that had been suspended for decades. Family statements reported in media coverage emphasized one central theme. The pain never truly went away. It only changed shape. For years, Deborah's loved ones lived with uncertainty. And uncertainty has its own emotional burden. It does not close wounds. It keeps them open in a different way, waiting for resolution that may or may not come. When the arrest became public, there was also recognition of something else. Persistence, not just from law enforcement, but from cold case investigators who refuse to abandon the file. Because cases like this are rarely solved by sudden breakthroughs alone. They are solved by patience, by preservation of evidence, by the decision to revisit what others might have considered finished, and by scientific progress that eventually catches up with unanswered questions. One of the most important lessons from this case is how dramatically forensic science has changed the justice landscape. In 1997, DNA analysis was limited in scope, databases were smaller, matching systems were slower and less comprehensive by 2020 standards. DNA profiling is significantly more sensitive. National databases allow broader cross-referencing. Fingerprint analysis is faster and more automated, and cold case review units are actively funded and expanding. What once seemed impossible to solve can now be re-examined with tools that did not exist at the time of the crime. But technology alone does not solve cases. It only creates opportunity. Someone still has to reopen the file. Someone still has to authorize the review. Someone still has to decide that a decades-old mystery is worth another attempt. And in this case, that decision changed everything. From a legal perspective, this case also reinforces an important principle. Time does not erase accountability. Even when decades pass, even when evidence is old, even when investigations go cold, if forensic evidence is preserved properly, it can still be evaluated under modern standards. That is one of the most significant shifts in modern criminal justice, and it is reshaping how cold cases are approached across the United States. For the community where this case began, the resolution, while still legally in process, represents something difficult to define. Not closure, not finality, but movement. After years of silence, the case is no longer static. It is active. It is being tested in court. And it is no longer trapped in uncertainty. Yet, even with arrests made and charges filed, one important truth remains. The legal process has not yet reached its conclusion. There is no final verdict, no sentencing, no judicial determination of guilt or innocence. Only allegations being examined under the standards of law. And that distinction matters deeply in any fair analysis of justice. So what remains now? For investigators, the answer is procedure. For courts, the answer is due process. For the accused, the answer is defense. And for the family, the answer is still unfolding. Because justice in long-term cold cases rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in stages, and perhaps the most important lesson of all is not procedural. It is human. This case demonstrates that even when time passes, evidence can endure. That even when investigations stall, progress can return. And that even when a case appears frozen, it is not necessarily forgotten. It may simply be waiting for science to catch up. For viewers, there is also a situational awareness takeaway that extends beyond this case. While this is a historical investigation, it reinforces general safety principles that remain relevant. Trust patterns in routine behavior. Sudden changes can matter. Maintain communication awareness with people who live alone or in isolated conditions. Report prolonged, unexplained absences sooner rather than later. Understand that forensic evidence can persist far longer than expected, and recognize that cold cases are not always closed cases. These are not conclusions about this case specifically. They are broader awareness principles drawn from decades of investigative experience. And finally, there is Deborah Kennedy herself. Beyond the case file, beyond the evidence, beyond the legal arguments, she represents something that every cold case ultimately returns to: a life that mattered. A routine that was interrupted. A story that was unfinished for far too long. Today, her case stands as a reminder of something both unsettling and hopeful. Unsettling because justice can take decades to arrive. Hopeful because it can still arrive at all, even after 29 years. Even after silence. Even after the world has moved on. And in that space between past and present, one truth remains clear. Some cases do not end. They wait. Until the moment the truth is finally ready to be heard. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe and share this video to your loved ones to keep them vigilant, informed, and security conscious. Here is another cold case that investigators thought was impossible to solve until a clue they missed years ago was discovered recently.